So the point about land is that it's finite. I think it was one of the Marx brothers who said, we don't make it anymore. So there's a finite amount of land within an international financial system where there's an infinite, almost infinite supply of credit, right? And so if you want to know why the price of land has risen, then you have to look at the financial system and you have to look at the amount of money, the wall of money that's aimed at this thing, which is the finite resource called land. When you throw money at something finite, everyone knows the price goes up, right? The thing about this finite land is that it's not just a property for someone to live in or to work in, and that it might increase in value. It is also collateral, right? You can take this property, you can buy this property, you can throw money at it and pay a huge amount of money for it, and then immediately you can use it as collateral to borrow even more money. If you are a private equity firm, a Wall Street bank, a hedge fund, or an asset management fund, and that is why land and housing and property is now so important to the finance sector. The finance sector can't manage without it because the finance sector needs collateral. You can't borrow money unless you can show that you have collateral that could be used in case of default. And so property is a wonderful thing for that purpose. And so here in Britain, we have a wall of global money coming from Russian oligarchs, coming from Chinese oligarchs, coming from Nigerian oligarchs, coming from Wall Street banks, mainly Wall Street banks, aimed at the tiny island that is Britain and the finite amount of land. And so what we have are house prices and property prices going through the roof.
So the built environment is one of the most valuable assets in today's globalized speculative economy. That is part of a bigger story that has been unfolding in finance capitalism over the last many years. This is something that shows in particular the role that finance has been having in our lives, the way in which it has been shaping our lives and our understanding of who we are, how we relate with the world around us, and of course how we inhabit the built environment, how we create it, how we adjust it to the needs of the market. Finance is this very powerful force that, through its speculative logic, is the driving force behind real estate, assigning value through markets onto goods, onto material goods.
I think when we talk about value creation in the city, then the biggest question is, where does the value of land, of urban land, ultimately comes from? And if you ask people who buy and sell real estate, they will tell you there's three things that contribute to the value of land in the city: location, location, and location. Of course, we know it, right? We know that it is about what is close and what is far that makes the land so pricey in the city. But then if we take one more step back and ask, where does this value of location comes from? Then, of course, it is collectively created by people in the city. I think that's the biggest fraud in the real estate speculation, that you take value that is collectively and historically created by people in the city, then you try to extract it in the end from the very people who created it.
By the term financialization, I refer to the process by which the forces and the imaginary of finance, the imaginary of markets, has become an integral part of our everyday life across the social domain, the political domain, even the intimate domain. Our everyday lives are now shaped by the priorities of financial markets. What this looks like on any given day is that we wake up, we take our very small family, personal, work decisions according to the logic of finance. We see things as a constant process of balancing risk and opportunity. The most obvious impact there is that we no longer merely associate the built environment with fulfilling a basic need for housing, for the safety and security and the comfort that this can provide, but we see it as an investment. That is a very important impact of financialization. That is, not just real estate actors are seeing our houses as an investment opportunity, but we, everyday people, everyone in society at the moment has an intuitive understanding where they sleep is not just material, it's an asset. If all of this is the outcome of a speculative game, and we increasingly, all of us, we understand ourselves as members, as partners in that speculative game, then there are some profoundly alarming consequences there.
The real tragedy of this conspiracy by speculators, real estate developers, is that they're doing it in secret and we know nothing about it. We are not interested, on the whole, in the way the financial system operates. We are preoccupied with day-to-day affairs. We worried about sex. We worry about relationships next door. We worry about immigrants. We spend a lot of time worrying about immigrants. And so we happily forget about and exclude those speculators and those real estate developers who are planning this moment to destroy the very fabric of our society so that they can make more money. Because if your land is finite, the only way you can keep reinvesting it and keep generating returns is by destroying it and starting again.
Is everything in the city up for demolition? I mean, potentially yes, because if we approach the land and the city through the speculative lens, then of course the biggest increase in value is through this constant demolition and rebuilding. And if you look at American cities, if you look at the history of New York, that's pretty much what happened and how the value was created. Now, in Europe, for years, it was a little bit different, but through the financialization and globalization of economy, Europe was also pulled into this cycle of demolition and creation.
This phenomenon is happening because economists, mainstream orthodox economists, have dictated this sort of policy. And it happens at two levels. On the one hand, the economics profession, and it is incredibly ideological. It's so wrong to think of economics as a science. It is a social science and it's very ideological. And the main thrust of today's economics is liberalization. It's neoliberal economic theory, on the one hand. On the other hand, economics dictates that actually there is no problem for the environment.
And it becomes a game of minimizing risks into a broader speculative market in order to attract the right investments that would allow you to survive as a housing association, as a housing structure. Of course, this is an argument that many have made. This leads not only to theoretical problems or to housing difficulties, but also to disasters like the Grenfell Tower collapse and the fire in London a few years ago. There you have a really palpable example of how the logic of financial speculation and the integration of real estate leads to the actual loss of life, not only to the degradation of livelihoods of residents, but to the actual loss of life.
The economics profession are those men are the guilty men. They have driven both the financing of our architecture, of our urban planning, and also, of our residential homes.
The architecture industry has, it's a long-running habit of architecture as service to capital. And it's often packaged as a service to common good in the popular media. But if you take an architect like Patrick Schumacher, he's fantastic because he's absolutely clear about what the architect's role really is in that sort of sector of commerce. But in most of the architectural discipline, we are trained on one hand to be the sort of handmaiden of capitalism and consolidate wealth at the expense of many other things, and to be the cultural excuse, if you like, for a lot of ecological and social damage.
It's very, very clear that there is a repeated practices that are never re-questioned and that always bring the same assessments and the same results. And we observed that when we studied carefully this French national policy, that first, it's always the principle to say that what is old, except the historical, is not good anymore. So, because it has a lot of problems. Second, that renovating is more expensive than demolishing and rebuilding. Third, that the people, they prefer to live in new places. But if you consider all of this very carefully, all this is wrong, totally wrong.
We often get the situation where a developer wants us to demolish a building because of their calculations of how much it would cost to demolish and build new versus renovate. And when you step into that case, if the structure in square meters is anything similar to what would be demolished in the first place, you find that all of the extra cost is actually an estimation of risk that has not been analyzed and a process of building that has not been estimated.
One of the things that should be changed also, that until now, the environmental performance of a new building, in CO2 and so on, was counted without taking in account the history of the place and if a building has been demolished before. So it was always extremely positive. But if you place in the balance the cost, CO2 cost of demolition of a building, then the balance will move in. So it's also a thing that should be changed. That you should account the history of the place.
A developer or anyone estimating the costs of transformation looks at these costs. They come into two factors. One of them is the unknowns of what you might find if you demolish something. You might find asbestos or some kind of strange structural situation that you didn't expect. And the second one is about the cost of finance, because we have a whole system that is very comfortable with financing new build because of the guaranteed return on investment. But because of the perceived risk, finance is more expensive.
I give you a very simple example that all of us have already been witnessed. If in the city center, especially here in Basel, where literally every square meter is already built, you have to build on the build almost always. And if you start in a competition with 10 people, 10 groups, and the developer or the one who, the HouseEurope, doesn't say, listen, you have to use this pre-existing garage or whatever it is to build a tower or to build whatever on top, then you're lost. You're fucked, so to speak, because the developer will always go to the ones that offer more FAR, to generate money. So that's not a law, but that's a potential, and you have to prepare the field so the potential is there, because all architects can deal with pre-existing structures if they are not in danger to lose eventually against some other project which is, for the developer, simply spoken, more promises more profit.
And we also saw it also hand in hand with what we call build on the build. So it's also tightly connected to what happens to the landscape and to the territory as a whole. So it's not only let's keep old structures or keep as much as possible, but it's also to keep the structure, because building new, you do it on a, let's say, on the new land. And to leave that land as nature or as much nature as possible is tightly linked to this same, let's say, imperatives.
I would go further in this and say no demolition should be allowed, except you prove that nothing can be done. Because, in fact, the calculation, you can always make them good. So I think it should be a principle, no demolition, no arrangement.
And we all know that together with agriculture, the construction sector is the biggest emitter of CO2. All the buildings that we see around are actually storages of CO2. Once upon a time, a lot of CO2 was emitted in order for these buildings to be built. One of the biggest problems that I see today is that the construction sector is not evolving according to the needs of people.
This construction sector is an entire ecology. It is made of real estate investors, financing bodies, regulators, architects, contractors, real estate again, and then potentially users. And all of that is this ecology of construction. Within the construction industry, there is debate about how much of this 40% is really related to construction and how much is related to use. All in all, it's 40%. The roles of these actors, of these construction industry actors, are divided but all connected to one another. I like to call this a chain of space production, like you would think of a commodity chain.
When you demolish a building, many things happen. So first of all, you lose all the CO2 that was consumed to build the original building. Then you have a huge amount of trucks that have to move all the debris. But it's incredible if you think of it. So the traffic will be congested. Then you have fine dust particles. And Belgium is one of the countries in which this phenomenon has been studied, and it has been proven that all these fine dust particles that come from traffic and from demolition, they affect your lungs, and especially in children. So you have health issues that are caused by demolition.
When a building is demolished, usually what it is replaced with is not to the benefits of the people who were occupying the previous building. And in that sense, the city loses its kind of social mixity, diversity, and, more generally, the kind of heterogeneity that makes them desirable. Which means that, by extension, demolition is an antisocial phenomenon.
If I can sum up all the crises with which we are confronted, I would say that the sum of all of them is the fact that we reached the limits of a system. So the main problem is that actually things that have a huge value, they cannot be evaluated. There is no price. They don't have a price.
Of course, this is speaking about the excruciating working condition that so many of our colleagues find ourselves in, the kind of very heavy patriarchal way that architecture is being practiced today under the tremendous pressure of the economy.
Unfortunately, today we are not paid for the value that we generate as architects. We are paid for the time we spend to produce the deliverables that are necessary in order to get the building permits, get the dossier for the contractors to make a bid to build the project.
This is about revolutionizing construction, rethinking entirely how we assemble all these elements, for instance. Are they assembled in a way that they can be disassembled, of course, but also thinking about how a construction detail will be taken care of. Think about a window, for instance. Are you able to clean that window? Are you able to repaint that particular piece of the house, different depending on how it's built and things like that? So revolutionizing construction also means by design.
It is to think better, to be more intelligent in the way you build, you reuse, you add to existing situations. But this ambition is absolutely necessary and for social housing or for any housing. This question of affordability, what is the best way for a building to be sustainable? I think it is that it is generous. It is only because we are making these standard buildings everywhere, or we're repairing in a standard way, that finally these buildings, they have no interest, they have no excitement, they create no pleasure to live in, and finally after 10 years, after 20 years, they are unsuccessful anymore.
How do we make it attractive as well to other economy players, other industries, the ones who do the service and maintenance? Maybe we are kind of blind to people who've been in the market all the time and now are deciding, but maybe there are other players who are just waiting to jump in. Exactly the maintenance companies or like the ones involved in the transformation. It's quite interesting now with all the resources and all the materials getting so expensive that it's this moment of stillness where you actually have an opportunity to start to rethink it. And there's an incentive in the clients to do this. So in a funny way, it makes many of our practices obsolete because we're like well-oiled machine for new construction.
80% of the work we've done is somehow a conversion. But the Tate, for instance, is very special insofar that what we use is not only, let's say, being reused and has a new beauty, ideally, because you see an old beam or you expose another industrial structure, but we invent something in that we take away the floor and open up that space. We invented a public space, and that's in fact a new project. But in fact, we haven't done anything. We just removed a little bit something. It's like a surgery. And that's almost the ideal case of a conversion and a reuse of a structure.
I think with regards to like this relationship between labor and resources, there's almost a direct parallel even in the energy sector. There's a lot of lobbyism and press about how many jobs will be lost if a coal power plant goes down. There's never the equivalent study as to how many jobs are created if it's distributed energy creation like wind or solar or whatever. And because the answer, of course, is that when you have this distributed intellectual labor or distributed construction, then you, of course, are in a system which demands more local capacity and demands more human capacity for the same value. And that's because centralized power, just like centralized building systems and techniques, are specifically designed to increase profit by reducing labor. That's the whole game of new construction. Everybody's dealing with the same materials. What they're optimizing for is how much you can squeeze labor out of the equation in terms of the cost.
And the question for me is simple. When you have one, it could mean one flat, one block, one slab. When you have one, you demolish one and you rebuild one. At the end, you have one. If you have one and you just add half of one, and at the end, you have 1.5. You spend less, you have more. And this is also what is related with ambition and escaping from standard, producing better spaces for people. It's not luxury spaces. It is just to find the way by working with less to give more at the end. It should be very clear. You have plenty of architects that are able to understand the buildings as they are, to see what is missing there, how they repair that, how they transform that, what is the capacity of transformation.
So the question always becomes, who's going to pay for this, right? It's really strange. Nobody asks that question when we go to war. Nobody asks that question when we have a pandemic and we have to nationalize the economy and we nationalised the economy. We've nationalised capitalism, and nobody batted an eyelid. At the height of the pandemic in April 2020, the banking system collapsed. It was catastrophic. It was as big a collapse as in 2007-9. People have forgotten about that. And what bailed them out? Central banks, taxpayers, ultimately, right? So we know that we can do these big things. We can finance it. Why? Because money is just the social construct. It's a promise to pay. If the bank gives me 300,000 euros, I promise to pay them back. And then those 300,000 euros go into the circulation in the economy. And then we lose sight of the fact that the way it was created was through this promise. And it's a social thing. We can change those promises. So we need to understand that money is something that we invented as human beings to enable us to undertake transactions. We've got to make it work for us instead of us working for money.
Das ist ein ganz großer Markt, der da geöffnet wird. Und ich glaube, da muss man sich natürlich auch bewusst werden, schaffen wir das als Architekten? Wollen wir diese Aufgaben übernehmen? Und da kann man sich natürlich auch nochmal die Bürostrukturen in Europa anschauen. Und 92% der Büros in Europa bestehen aus 1- bis 5-Mann-Büros. Das heißt, diese Büros sind ja nicht international unterwegs. Die meisten sind wirklich ortsverbunden, arbeiten regional, kennen den Markt vor Ort, kennen die Handwerker, haben da ein entsprechendes Netzwerk. Und das sind natürlich dann für die Zukunft diejenigen, die auch dieses Ziel des Umbaus in die Breite tragen können.
What would happen if the entire labor force, which is currently used in new construction, would be rerouted into renovation? Well, instead of the 120 years that it will take for the entire housing stock of Switzerland to be renovated, it would take 12, which I think speaks of how reinventing our construction industry is never about losing jobs and never about destroying existing trades, but about rerouting them into a virtuous construction industry.
So if we look at the problem of demolishing buildings the other way around and see the keeping of a building being stimulated financially, then, for instance, in Belgium, we do have a difference in VAT. VAT when you renovate is 6%. VAT when you build something new is 21%. So, of course, there is an incentive.
Wir brauchen eigentlich ein Wirtschaftsimpuls in dem Bereich und wir brauchen auch einen Impuls, dass in diesem Bereich auch wirklich etwas passiert. Und dann ist der erste Schritt gewesen, okay, wir haben den Green Deal. Green Deal ist eine strategische Ausrichtung über alle hinweg in Europa, also politisch. Der zweite Schritt war das Klimagesetz, wo man sich rechtsverbindlich auf die Klimaneutralität bis 2050 geeinigt hat. Und der dritte Schritt ist dann die Umsetzung. Und ein Teil dieser Umsetzung war die Renovation Wave. Und in dieser Renovation Wave wird die Dekarbonisierung unseres Gebäudebestandes in Angriff genommen. Ziel ist es, diese Renovierungsrate zu verdoppeln. Und andere Experten sprechen auch, man muss sie verdreifachen oder sogar vervierfachen. Und das bedeutet effektiv, wenn man das einfach übersetzt, jedes Büro im Moment müsste doppelt so viele Projekte bearbeiten.
And to be honest, my experience is that a lot of investors and a lot of entrepreneurs really would like to have those incentives, would like to work sustainably. They're like you and me. They too have a conscience, really. And so if we gave them incentives to do the right thing, which is keep this building, make sure that we reuse it effectively and use it for housing, rather than destroying it and giving it as an asset to a global bank.
We can think of solutions that deploy the daringness, the openness, the radicality of speculation with what we already have.